que es profesor de Economía y Asuntos Internacionales y Públicos en la Universidad de Columbia. Es doctor en Economía por la Universidad de California, Berkeley. Su investigación abarca la economía política, la historia económica y la economía laboral, con un enfoque en los efectos económicos de las transiciones políticas, la historia económica de la esclavitud y las instituciones laborales y la migración internacional. Y además es investigador asociado en el MBR, es miembro externo de la facultad en el Instituto de Santa Fe y codirector del Centro de Economía Política de Columbia. Y esta conferencia va a ser en inglés y I switched to English now just to say a couple of anecdotes with Suresh that we share a little bit of our time at Berkeley, and is a very good dear friend. And if I can say about someone that a lot of our classmates had an influence on us, but Suresh had a tremendous intellectual influence on me. And I remember that our classmates, we were like worried about the exam, I don't know, about the next day. And it's like, Suresh, we're having lunch, and Suresh, what are you doing? No, I'm going to a seminar in the anthropology department. And then the next one, he said, I'm going to a seminar in the sociology department. So, he basically, and he said, Suresh, how do you do this? Like, no, I don't sleep. I sleep like 4 hours per day, and that's Suresh. And then the other one, for me, at least, I felt privileged to have a friend like Suresh, because we used to go to coffee for a coffee, and then it's like for another class for me, because Suresh was explaining to me the history of the world. And I remember once I have to recognize that I was ignorant about Central American politics or history. And I remember Suresh one day over coffee is like, no, he was angry about and telling me about the influence of the CIA and the Arbenz government, and I was the United Fruit Company and coffee in Central America. I was like, Suresh, I don't know what you are talking about. And he's like, no, you should read one very important book. And he recommended me this book, and I still have it. And I read this book after all my ignorance about that discussion with Suresh. And then another time is like we were over coffee too, and he was discussing 19th century in the US and the influence of the robber barons. And it's like, I don't know, I know nothing, Suresh, about that. And it's like, no, this other book. And I bought another book about the robber barons. So every time I get with Suresh, it's always a recommendation about some topic. So probably after today's talk, I will have to buy a book about unions and about something. So, and we're going to learn a lot because Suresh is amazing what he knows and his passion about economics and about life in general. So and I think this is your third time here. This is the third time that Suresh comes to El Colegio. Probably here are some alumni, probably, I don't know, Emmanuel, if you were here when Suresh came the last, some of the 2 times. Well, this is the 3rd time that Suresh is here, and we are very, very happy to have you and to hear what you have to say about unions and history. Excellent. So, welcome.
Thank you. Okay, my daughter speaks Spanish, and so I apologize that I can't.
Let me only, because we are online, yes. Okay.
Okay, and so I'm deeply, this is a talk I deeply wish I could give in Spanish, because for many reasons, but it's a handbook chapter with Simon Yeager and Benjamin Schofer for the Handbook of Labor Economics. And it's about unions, collective bargaining, and the wage structure. And just also in the conversation this morning, following along with the help of Google Translate, I think it reflects some of these themes, because even if you don't care about unions per se, one of the things that's interesting about them is that there's no master theory. it really is this place where like different countries have radically different institutions, and it just is very nationally contingent. And so what the point of this handbook chapter is kind of like embrace that heterogeneity and understand the details, and every country is going to look different, and those differences are really important for understanding this. And so we kind of close out on a view, but that doesn't mean economics isn't useful, because in particular we're going to use the tools of very standard 1960s like Greg Lewis and then David Card kind of labor economics to put structure on this diversity. But I think we're going to see that like the simple US story of what unions are just doesn't do a lot of work in explaining kind of how unions work around the world. So let me start with this graph. So this is a graph from one of my papers with Ilyana Kuzemko, Dan Herbst, and Hank Farber. And it's kind of just the standard case that if you've studied US labor economics, you kind of know very well. Union density goes up and then goes down. Inequality tracks it very closely. And I want to say that the literature on unions has spent too much time on this picture. And this is my fault maybe, but I've also spent a lot of time making this picture, so I show it a lot. But I want to show you results from another paper. This is Canada. And so this is like union density and inequality, and you kind of see a very different, it's a sort of similar U, but the timing doesn't work out the same at all. And the collapse in inequality is before the union density, and the increase is kind of independent of any changes in union density. And so this is, kind of the research agenda has been trying to put together historical union data sets in as many countries as you can, going back as far as you can. So I've done this now for Canada and the US. I tried to do it for Mexico for this talk, so thank you for the invitation, because making this talk together meant we have to get into Mexican labor unions data and understand it. And so I tried to make this graph for Mexico, and here's what I came up with, which unfortunately I could only find measures going back to the 1980s or so and not anything before that. That would be an interesting thing to do. But then, just putting on top of inequality, you can kind of see, again, union density is declining, but inequality is kind of, also somewhat declining depending on how you measure it. I'm be curious about these statistics. And then if you look around the world, there's sort of a union membership has been declining everywhere. It's declining in the OECD. It's also declining in the non-OECD countries. And some of that increase, though, at the bottom is coming both because of imbalances in the sample, but also because many countries have automatic union coverage as a function in the formal sector. So you're getting, as countries formalization increases, mechanically you get an increase in some union density. And because union membership is, I pay a dues to an organization and I get some services of representation and collective bargaining from that. But then who the contract covers is different from who's a member of the union. And you see this in Mexico because you have the ley contrato that sort of extends in the public sector. You have this in over Brazil and Argentina, where the collective bargaining agreements extend across the entire sector, but there's not necessarily, the members are not necessarily the only people covered. And so you can see there's a lot of variation in coverage, and these two things are distinct. So this is a plot of the union membership rate on collective bargaining coverage. And the United States is a country that's pretty close to the 45-degree lines, where you have to be a member to be covered and a covered to be a member. But you can consider a country like France, where membership is actually only about 9%. It's less than the US. But coverage is is higher than 80%, because those collective bargaining agreements cover everyone. So when you're teaching US students, you're like, well, union density is only 9%, but 80% of people are covered. And so it's a different concept. And too much of the literature sort of assumed that union membership is the thing that we should be studying, but union coverage is in fact the thing that varies a lot more and is like the thing that influences wage setting. That's different from union membership. And so when you just scatter it around the world, there's a few countries that are sort of on the line. Mexico should be somewhere here. I think we didn't have microdata on Mexico. It's not in here. It's also close to the 45-degree line. But you can see there's many countries that are far away from the 45-degree line where coverage is much higher than membership. And you can see the coverage is also negatively associated with inequality in the cross-section, but not so in the panel. So it's a question, I think, we kind of want to examine the coverage and see whether or not there is any kind of relationship with inequality. And so these sort of facts motivated us to write this handbook chapter. There's a number of previous handbook chapters, but I'll say particularly none of them have tried to take this international approach, particularly looking at non-developed countries as part of the same framework. And we try to do that as much as we can. And basically, I think there was a lot focused on unions in the US. There's even some focused on unions, on labor market institutions. But I think since the 1990s, there's the increase in inequality has gone up, but also thanks to Piketty and others, there's an interest in inequality that's between capital and labor, as well as in wage inequality. Even as union membership has declined, collective bargaining coverage has continued to stay high. And then I think in particular, a whole bunch of administrative data sets of matched employer-employee data from both developing countries and OECD countries have become available. Those of you that are labor economists are well aware of this. And those are often coming from contexts in which collective bargaining is a big part of wage setting. And so, and you can often merge that employer-employee data to details about collective bargaining contracts, where you'll see wages specified in the collective bargaining contracts, and you'll see that the collective bargaining contracts will matter for the wages that you see in the administrative data. And part of, I think, this rise of administrative data has meant that economists have increasingly been interested in studying both the data and the sources of variation that comes from non-US industrial relations contexts. And so I just think because of this availability of data from these rich, very non-US contexts, we just have to understand those institutions, and they work differently. And partly for the reason that they look different, and we can make sense of this, is because there's been a rise of the understanding of monopsony and imperfectly competitive labor markets. And one of the things that monopsony makes possible is that there's lots of diversity that can coexist in equilibrium when you have imperfect competition, which means you can have unions and non-unions, you can have high-wage firms and low-wage firms. And so when you have that kind of view that the labor market has lots and lots of imperfect competition and monopsony in it, you have a space for diversity of practices to kind of coexist. And so you can kind of, you don't have to say competition will sort of force everyone to do the exact same thing. And then, of course, there's the credibility revolution, which kind of means that we're interested in all of these things. And it also means that we can take things that economists used to think were just iron laws of truth, that unions always increase unemployment, for example, and subject them to the same kinds of empirical tests that we've done for the minimum wage literature, for example. Okay, so what we do in this chapter is talk about how unions and collective bargaining affect the wage structure. What we're going to try to do is embrace this qualitative heterogeneity and just really talk about all of these different countries and the varieties of collective bargaining systems around the world. But we're going to try to organize this heterogeneity into kind of labor economics terms, where we have a simple two-equation framework, where we have a wage equation and a selection equation, and we're going to try to characterize all of this heterogeneity in terms of differences in union wage premia, the extent of compression, the selection of how who's in a union, who isn't, and then spillovers between union and non-union workers. And we're trying to offer this as a lens for organizing the existing literature and putting together data from diverse labor markets into this two-equation kind of framework. And then we can ask kind of how do features of these different collective bargaining systems influence these different parameters and try to make sense of the heterogeneity. Okay, so this is what I'm going to do. I'm probably going to skip over the model for time, and it's also super simple, so I'll just do it in graphs. So what we sort of want to highlight is that different collective bargaining institutions vary in very different ways. So for example, bargaining can happen either at the level of the firm, which happens in like the private sector in the US, Canada, and Mexico, but it can also happen at the level of the industry. And sometimes you can even have like the whole nation is covered by like kind of a jointly agreed collective bargaining system. And so that's going to, the level at which collective bargaining happens is going to matter for how much wage compression there is. There's going to be coordination between workers and employers, like so which workers are in the same union. Do you have both high-skilled and low-skilled workers in the same union that they kind of have to, that the union has to react to those interests? Do you have large and small employers in the same employers association? And while there's a lot of work done on unions, there's less work done on employers associations, but that's the other side of the bargain in many of these countries is that you have often very powerful employers associations, and who's in them is going to matter for the outcomes of these collective bargaining agreements. And then you can see all these collective bargaining agreements, and then one of the things that you immediately see is that not everyone complies with the, and sometimes that's not just because they're not following the law, it's because there's provisions in the collective bargaining agreement that lets an employer opt out if the product market isn't good enough, or if there's like have a hardship clause. And so there's many mechanisms by which an employer is given ways to opt out of the collective bargaining agreement. And then there's the question of what you can bargain over. So sometimes you can only bargain over wages and working conditions. Other times you can bargain over employment. Sometimes you can even bargain over investment. And so what you can actually, unions and employers can bargain over is also something that different systems treat differently. And then, of course, there's just the degree of state involvement. So traditionally, for example, in the United Kingdom, the government stayed out of union negotiations. It was all sort of private contracts. And that's kind of also been a tradition in the United States. But in many countries, the government is actively involved as part of like the labor boards in Mexico, or in many countries, the government is like the third party in the collective bargaining agreement. And and then they can also enforce that agreement using courts or using labor inspectors. And then there's also a question of, do you extend the collective bargaining agreement to all the workers in a sector? And that has to be done by the government, and countries will vary by that. So this is like just kind of a graph we made from the paper, the level at which collective bargaining happens at different things. So a bunch of countries will have, for the same coverage level, some of the contracts will be at the industry level, say like Finland, and while Romania, it's almost all at the firm level, even though the coverage levels are very similar. Okay, so we're going to, what we do in the paper is do case studies where we try to talk about the details of lots of countries, where we outline the major union federations, the level of centralizations, the trends in coverage, their political affiliations, and we try to cover as many developing countries as we could get kind of good data for. So China, India, South Africa, Latin America, mostly it's been Argentina and Brazil, but thanks to this talk, we've now added Mexico. And aspirational is kind of like, we think that this framework can take any data set where you have kind of wages and union density and kind of regular Minserian controls, you can kind of operationalize this framework if you in a harmonized data. Okay, so our very simple framework is just there's wages and selection. And this comes from About and Farber and Card. And the idea is that there's just two ways to think about what unions do. One is unions will both like change the wage a worker is paid, and then but they'll also vary in terms of who's selected to be inside of a union. And so we're going to operationalize these two, we're going to estimate these two equations in kind of every country we can get data for and do it in kind of as consistent a way as possible. So you know what? I'm just going to do this in a graph. So if you wanted to think about what we do is we operate as like we take all the non-union workers and we run kind of a simple human capital wage regression where we regress their wage on all of their labor market characteristics like age, education, et cetera. And then we make the predicted non-covered wage, and then we predict and then we look at how the covered workers actual observed wages vary with their predicted non-covered wages. So if you thought, okay, if you just thought that union coverage just raised your wage by a constant percentage, you would just see this level shift up in the wage. But then when you have that the unions also reduce the returns to high human capital, for example, or compress the distribution of wages, they're both going to they can both raise wages, but they can also raise wages more for low wage workers and compress them at the top. And so you're going to get a tilt in the slope. And then you can think about characterizing what unions do in terms of the tilt of the slope and the shift in the intercept. And that's what we do. And then you can kind of think about where does this intersect and operationalize where the intersection happens. And so I will skip this in the interest of time. But one of the things we do, so basically I'll just talk through what we have, is that we can use this two-equation model to think about the contribution of unions to inequality. So the wage of an observed worker is going to be whether or not they're covered times their covered wage, plus whether or not they're not covered times their non-covered wage. And so you can think about that as the coverage premium, the union premium here, and then this compression parameter, which we'll call kappa minus 1, which will tell you whether or not unions kind of reduce the returns to your latent wage. And then taking the variance of this wage, you can minus the variance of the non-union wage distribution. That kind of summarizes the overall effect of unions on inequality, and this is kind of what's implemented by CARD 2001 and CARD Lemieux-Riddell 2020. This also naturally maps into this Donardo-Fortin-Lemieux distributional reweighting that we're going to do, and I'll show you some results from that. Okay, harmonized evidence from around the world. So what do we need to do this? We need worker level data, we need union membership, and more importantly, collective bargaining coverage. And ideally, we have rich demographic information, and we take whatever firm information that we can get. And we would like to harmonize this across countries. So we harmonize the following data sets. So it turns out the European Labor Force Survey is not a good data set for this. But there's what's called the European Structure of Earnings Survey, which was kind of great for us, which had put together harmonized survey data for every European country, including the UK, when it was still in Europe. And it has individual collective bargaining coverage, and it has a repeated cross-section. And then we also use the US Current Population Survey and the Canadian Labor Force Survey, and now I've added the Mexican INEGI to this. Yes. Okay, so what do? We just run, we want to estimate this wage equation. So we kind of estimate a harmonized Mincer model where we predict, for the non-union sector, we regress your log wages on a bunch of characteristics, and we get a predicted wage. And then, what we can do is then look at the covered wage as a function of your predicted wage plus some union premium. We have, of course, selection on unobservables. This is just a descriptive exercise. This isn't causal. So we implement this idea in logs, and then we demean to sort of benchmark everything to the 25th percentile of the non-union wage distribution so that the beta is identifying the premium for the 25th percentile. And then we estimate the selection equation where we then regress the probability of being covered as a function of this predicted non-union wage. And so we're going to plot bin scatter plots of the probability of being covered by these bins, and you can think about this as the outcome of a two-sided selection model if you were, which is how it's been implemented in the United States. But we just kind of take it as an empirical measure of sort of operationalizing a variety of different selection processes that are happening differently in all kinds of countries. So this is what the wage equation in the US looks like. So this is your predicted non-covered wage, and you can see the union wage structure is compressing, right? It raises wages more at the bottom and less at the top. And so when you kind of run the slope, it kind of looks like it has this tilt in it. And so when you sort of look at this covered wage equation, you get a union premium of about 20%, and you get a kappa of 0.81, so this subtract 1 from it to get how much the slope tilts. Okay, so that's the US, that's kind of the classic version of this picture. So I did it for Mexico, and what's interesting is that the kappa, so this is just private sector workers as best as I could operationalize it. So you get a solid union premium of about 20%, but the kappa is negative. What does that mean? It's like unions are increasing inequality, that they have like a higher premium up here than down here. So this is sensitive to specification, and I'd love to talk with you, those that know more about this data than I do, exactly how to operationalize the counterfactual here. But I thought it was like not consistent with my stereotype of unions, and you know, interesting that you know unions are disequalizing in their effects on the wage structure. And then, just to give you an example, so in Germany we have both coverage and membership, and they vary separately. So we can operationalize union membership separately from union coverage. And what you can see is that union coverage is like a smaller premium than membership, and also like smaller degree of compression. So this is like, but they both kind of have this compressing effect on the wage distribution, and they both come with a premium. Okay, so what about selection? That's the effects on the wage structure. So in the United States, collective bargaining environment is one in which collective bargaining coverage is almost identical with union membership. Of course, it's tiny. It's 6% of the private sector. And the agreements are generally at this establishment level. So the firm or the establishment is the level at which contracts are negotiated. And then the traditional recognition process has been this National Labor Relations Board secret ballot election, which is, I can talk about this for hours on end. I run a pile of experiments with unions where we're trying to like, it's like J-Powelling the labor movement. And so a lot of experiments sort of like involve working on this process, and I have great stories about it. But there's also new processes that are coming online in the US with card check and sectoral bargaining. And so in a bunch of states, in Minnesota, California, and New York, we're seeing like sectoral bargaining, which looks much more like Latin American style things where you have automatic extension of a contract into non-covered workers. And that's sort of happening in like low wage labor markets in a bunch of states in the US. So this is what worker selection looks like in the United States. So this is like the predicted wage on the union share. And you can see unions are overrepresented in the middle of the wage distribution. So which is kind of, I think, been documented. It's like unions are, workers at this part of the wage distribution don't want to be in unions because of the compression effect. And down here, firms don't want to be covered by unions because they have to pay low-wage workers a high premium, so they fight really hard. And so the resulting thing results in kind of two-sided selection, so you get this heap in the middle. But also you have firm-side selection where the firms that are able to kind of like sustain unionization tend to be larger. So if you just kind of look in the CPS at the log number of employees on share union, you kind of definitely see that like higher value added, larger firms are more likely to be unionized. What does this look like in Mexico? Well, so we have declining union density as above. So again, I'm open to this being revised by the people in this room that know more about this. My understanding was that prior to the 2019 law, coverage was determined at the firm level by a labor board, and a union employer would petition the labor board for recognition. But of course, there were many of these like paper unions. They're called ghost unions in China. They're called white unions somewhere else. There's like, this is ubiquitous in developing countries, is like you have these paper unions that don't do anything for their workers. And that was traditionally in the US was company unions before the 1930s was ubiquitous in the US. But my other understanding of Mexico is also that these contracts are also kind of closed shop agreements in many sense, where like you have to be a dues-paying member of the union to stay employed at these employers, so that basically union coverage winds up being identical to membership in many firms, so that you can still use membership as kind of a proxy for coverage. And so that was my kind of assumption going into this, and happy to be corrected about this. And then what I find interesting is, I know this 2019 labor law didn't do anything yet, really, but it is interesting because it was like a rewrite of the Mexican labor law in the context of a renegotiation of NAFTA. And so it'll be like interesting to see both like whether or not you can kind of see effects of this in data at some point. So this is selection in Mexico. So this is predicted non-covered log wage on coverage share. It's just positive. The higher latent wage, and this is part of what, high wage workers are more likely to be covered by a union. And this is only the private sector. So this doesn't have the teachers in it. This is not the teachers. It's even in the private sector you have this, so I was worried about the teachers sort of driving all of this relation, but it's no. And this is the firm side selection in Mexico, and you can just see it's super steeply selected basically when you get to the highest firm size that you have in the INEGI data. Okay, and in Germany, you have a very different collective bargaining selection process. So you have like coverage, but what happens, who gets to decide coverage? Firms, so because firms can voluntarily opt out of coverage in Germany. And so you can have these employer associations and unions meet, they negotiate an agreement, but then the firm is like, opts out and says, I don't want to be covered. And so what you wind up with is like this again, this kind of U-shaped coverage pattern, because again, high wage workers don't want to be in unions, and low wage employers don't want coverage. And you see this both in coverage and in membership as kind of this U-shaped pattern. Okay, and this is firm side selection in Germany with much better data than we have in either the US or Mexico, and it's just like blisteringly strong correlation between coverage and measures of firm size or productivity. Okay, so how much time do I have? Great, I'm good. Okay, so let's do premia, compression, and selection across countries. So we do this, we implement these different equations in all of the sort of 35 countries that we have data for. So this is the coverage premium across countries. So this is, for example, in Greece, Finland, and Denmark, you have negative union premium. But of course, and this is going to be a hint of what's coming, that's because you have such high levels of coverage that the workers that are not covered are weird in some way. They're either like informal workers or like part-time workers, or it's an oddly selected lot to be not covered in some of these labor markets, and so you're going to get this negative union premium, and then you kind of have this upward sloping. Then it's just kind of like union premium is positive, and sort of varies a lot between, say, around like 5% and like 35%. So that's Hungary is the highest union premium. And then when you run the regression of share covered across countries on premia, you have this kind of consistent with this weird selection pattern, this result that the highest coverage countries have some of the lowest premia, because the workers that are not covered in these countries are kind of strange in some way. And then you have that actually in these like low coverage countries, the union premium is the highest. So it's like in the US, you have a substantial 20% union premium. You can't extrapolate that and say that's the union premium that would stay the same if you expanded coverage, because you're both going to be selecting different kinds of workers and different kinds of firms into coverage as you expanded it. And so, you can't take that the union premium is not going to be a monolith across lots and lots of countries. It's going to look very different. Depending on at least the share covered in the whole country. And then similarly with patterns of compression, not as stark, but again, there's kind of like not really much of a relationship between how much compression a system of industrial relations does and what share of the workers are covered. Maybe there's a little bit of a negative relationship, but it's not particularly strong. And then you kind of have these patterns of union selection where, again, selection, sorry, I didn't go over this equation, but the selection is measuring how positively selected are workers into unions. So like when this is very high, it means that unions are positively selected, which means that high wage workers are more likely to be in unions. And so you see when you have, low coverage share, you'll have there's this kind of positive selection coefficient. The only people that are in unions are relatively educated or relatively skilled, and then as union collective bargaining coverage increases, you kind of get that the selection becomes negative, which means that workers are like more likely to come from the bottom part of the wage distribution. Okay, so in some ways the punchline of the paper is that this whole labor economics way of looking at this is missing the boat, even though we just did a lot of work doing it, is basically that it's really assuming that that two-equation model is really assuming that the treatment of union is an individual level thing that affects an individual worker, and that you can think of the non-union workers as kind of like a control group for the union workers. But I think what we're sort of learning in the literature recently is that it's really hard to think about collective bargaining without thinking about the effects it has on the whole labor market, including the non-union workers. And so there's just like, I think where this literature is going to go is spillovers. And that's sort of what we conclude with is that, and which is really hard for labor economists. I think like labor economists, I think are very, the unit of observation is an individual worker and all the variation needs to live at the level of an individual worker. And then we see macro people running these like big macro regressions and we're like, that's not identified. I'm emulating David Card. But I think it's like really hard for us to make progress on really what industrial relation systems do if you're not willing to account for these kinds of spillovers that unions have on non-union workers. And there's some evidence. There's even some evidence. So like this Fortin, Lloyd, and Lemieux paper basically tried to augment the sort of DiNardo, Fortin, Lemieux framework to allow for spillovers, and basically finds that union density, raises wages of non-union workers such that if you in fact like account for that, you get that you kind of double the effect that unions have on wage inequality, for example, by accounting for spillovers. Basically, everywhere you look at it and you run the regression, when you run the regression of like for non-union workers, of wages of non-union workers on share covered in your labor market, it's always significant and it's generally positive. In theory, it could be positive or negative, right? Like the classic model of unions has that the union workers, are excluding the non-union workers and forcing them into like worse jobs, and so the spillovers from unions ought to be negative. But every time you just run the naive regression, you get kind of positive effects. It's never identified, so we don't really know this. But Fortin, Lloyd, and Lemieux try to construct an instrumental variable for overall union density, but it's not amazing. One thing I think that's also touches on my other like main interest is that, and those of you, all of you in Latin America know this, is that unions are also deeply enmeshed in electoral politics. They're attached to political parties, they turn out the vote. There's a great paper by Larraguet and co-authors about in Mexico, like when the voting booth is in a public school, you get that an additional vote bump for the candidate supported by the teachers union. But unions, even in the U.S., everywhere, they're as important for like both lobbying for policy, for campaign contributions, for getting out the vote, And this, so we have a complementary paper, me and Ethan Kaplan, in the annual reviews that's kind of really surveying this literature on the political effects of unions. And we sort of, this is much more US focused, but it's really that union membership is also like, it changes voting behavior and it changes volunteering, and unions can influence the behavior of politicians. So, and this political economy dimension can then mean that unions are then changing the whole policy environment, and that's going to affect the wages of non-union workers. And so you wouldn't pick that up in your micro wage regression. And so I think all of these dimensions of spillovers, it also means that, it's kind of really difficult to study labor unions using only economics. It means you have to go into all of these processes that are the domains of political scientists and even a lot of sociologists, right? Because it's traditionally been the way the sociologists study labor unions, for example, it's often the case that the labor union sort of sets the wage norm in a labor market, and that everyone is worried about deviating from it. And it doesn't happen through the law or formal policy process. It's just that's the standard, and we're gonna stick with it. And what keeps that standard in place? Why does that persist? Is I think much more has to do with norms and informal sanctions than the law. So all of this is to say is that spillovers, I think, are an important part of this. And so we're gonna just do something super basic, which you could never publish in a paper, but because it's a handbook chapter, you can stick whatever in it. And so we're just gonna run the naive regression in the non-union workers. We're gonna kind of include the share unionized in the same labor market as a predictor of the non-union wage. And once you do this, you can kind of work it out and just kind of see that the estimated union premium is going to be biased downwards, because you're going to basically be you're going to be comparing unionized workers to non-unionized workers, but the non-unionized workers' wages are influenced by the share unionized in that same labor market. So this is not identified. So what we can do, though, is we can try to estimate this sigma parameter, or we can kind of take values from the literature that has tried to estimate this and impose that calibrated value and see how it changes the estimates of beta. And so, so this is where we fix so this is the relationship between coverage and beta with and without spillovers. So you can see, let me talk about this one. So this is when we don't have spillovers, the blue line is what I showed you earlier. So this downward slope between share covered and beta. But once you impose these spillovers at the local labor market level, you kill that correlation. So this is all of that correlation between coverage and density, between the union premium and density, is kind of driven by the covariance of individual membership with the non-union members in that labor market being covered, having a high share union in them. And so, this is just suggestive, and it attenuates it when you just use the empirical spillovers. So this is just suggestive, but it suggests that getting these spillovers right is important for understanding what unions do to the wage structure. Okay, and so the last part is to come back to what the literature has traditionally focused on, which is the effects on wage inequality. And so the natural question is can the micro effects of unions, without considering spillovers, explain this aggregate correlation that I showed you at the beginning between degree of coverage and wage inequality? So having this parametric model where we've kind of estimated both selection and coverage effects, we can kind of immediately set the union coverage to 0 and see what changes in wages come from that. And so we can calculate kind of this counterfactual wage distribution. We can also implement this Gennaro-Fortin-Lemieux semi-parametric reweighting, which is I think it's just again, this weird social norm that every time you study unions, you have to do this DFL thing. It's, but you have to. And so we did for every country in our sample. And under both of these exercises, you can check what happens to inequality when you increase union density to 100% accounting for the patterns of coverage and selection and compression in that country, or decrease it to 0%, again, accounting for all of these mechanisms of selection, compression, and premium. So I'll show you an example. So we did this for Mexico. I don't know, Ray, maybe you did this sometime before, but I couldn't find this anywhere in the literature, so I just kind of did it. And the nice thing about having to do it for every country is that you just have a set of package of programs that you just like can throw at any new country's data set. So this is like the empirical coverage in Mexico is like 9%. You have like a Gini. So this is obviously about half the real Gini because we're throwing out informal sector workers and a bunch of public sector workers. And this is the 90-50 ratio and 50-10 ratio. And then you can sort of ask what happens when you kind of reduce union density to 0. And you're going to get like that the variance falls when you de-unionize, which is like not what you normally get in rich countries. And similarly, when you fully unionize, you're going to get that wage inequality goes up. And that just follows from that patterns of like the lack of compression that unions are doing. And I can get these to move around depending on the specification and stuff, so don't take them as like literal truth. But it's interesting that the fully deunionized counterfactual has like lower inequality in Mexico. And so this is what the density kind of looks like. Okay, so then what we can do with these counterfactuals is ask, basically, this counterfactual is kind of the purely micro counterfactual, right? So we're going to take each individual worker that's in a union, and we're going to say, we're going to give you what we predict your non-union wage is going to be. And then we can measure wage inequality in that world. And so if the sort of standard labor economics way of thinking about what unions did was right, then the aggregate correlation between union density and inequality should be completely erased when you instead put the counterfactual deunionized inequality measure as the outcome, because you're taking out all the effects of union, so there shouldn't be any residual correlation between union density and inequality. And so the deunionized counterfactual inequality should be uncorrelated with unionization. And we kind of did this experiment in the US, in Farber et al., where we can kind of show that this can't explain the time series correlation in the US either. So basically you fully like deunionize the microdata, but you still get that aggregate union density is correlated with inequality in the same U-shaped pattern. So of course there's identification issues here, but it's striking that the micro effect doesn't go even halfway towards explaining the macro effect. And we get a similar thing in our sorry for the last minute graph here, but this is basically the blue line is the empirical variance of wages, which is not deunionizing at all, and plotted against the share coverage, and you get this downward slope that was the same as what I showed you earlier with the Gini. But then we fully deunionize, and that's the red line, and it's identical to the blue line. So it's like so this fully deunionized micro counterfactual is almost as strongly correlated with aggregate union coverage as the empirical inequality. So of course you could just be like none of this. Yeah, it suggests that it's all spurious, right? Like the correlation between union coverage and inequality is either it's just driven by other things that are jointly determining both, or you can think of that the spillovers are really important to get right. And this micro effect of unions isn't sort of capturing like the bulk of what unions do to the labor market. And so that's where I'll end and take lots of questions. And I can talk about all kinds of things about this in and around unions. I have a lot of projects on them. But in some sense, where this chapter leaves off is kind of trying to emphasize that collective bargaining institutions are thick. They're like very nationally specific, and they differ in lots of ways across countries. And that heterogeneity ought to be respected, and there's probably not like some one-size-fits-all model of unions out there. And we want to really emphasize that coverage is distinct from membership. And a lot of the labor market surveys, survey data is generally focused on membership because you can ask someone, are you a union member? But administrative data kind of forces you to focus on coverage because that's like whose wages are actually affected by the contract as different from the members. We presented this framework for organizing the microdata on unions across country, and we implemented it in cross-country harmonized microdata. What we would love to do, right, we just wound up doing Europe and North America for basically because we don't know what we're doing anywhere else. But what would be really great is to kind of have this kind of like high quality harmonized microdata on coverage and membership in developing countries. And I think we're almost there, at least for Latin America. Like I think there's a lot of countries in Latin America that both have this quality data that and coverage that you could do it. In terms of like research going forward, there's like a whole pair of things to do. One is getting the spillovers right, so modeling and measuring diverse spillovers. And I think it's probably difficult to do this with empirical evidence alone. You're probably going to have to take some stands on networks and models and and get into the details of that. There's a very nice paper by Borjasek and Koloman Schermer that just came out like a few weeks ago that was basically showed how you can aggregate a whole bunch of the regression discontinuities and close selections to get like an aggregate shifter of union density, and they find like sort of like big effects of aggregate union coverage on the wages of non-union workers. And so that's, I think, like one of the ways in which you're going to make progress on spillovers. The other thing that I think is like comes back to the more historical and political economy things about this is that it's really a mistake to sort of think that you can isolate the collective bargaining system of a country independently from the whole set of political and historical forces that got you there. And so they're going to be co-determined, like the collective bargaining system that you have is going to be is going to be determined in many ways like the tax system that you have and like the unemployment system that you have. And it's going to kind of come out of various like historical accidents. Like the Mexican system of industrial relations is definitely set up after the Mexican Revolution to solve some very particular political problems that Cardenas sort of was facing. And so I think like getting under the hood of like the historical origins and sort of critical junctures driving these collective bargaining institutions is a great place to look. And so, we can kind of think about labor market institutions jointly with kind of more fundamental political economy things like the way we think about institutions generally. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Excellent, Suresh. Thank you for your great presentation. So we have some questions. Okay, Emanuel. Por ahí si pasan el micrófono. Okay. We are online, so take this one.
Yeah, so have you done this exercise separately for private and public sector employees?
So, sorry, I should have said everything we do here is private sector. Oh. We exclude the public sector for everything. That we're trying to get the private sector isolated. I think the public sector just poses a lot more. It's not the same wage setting process. It's just like not the same. The unions don't have the same objectives. It's a different animal. So we're trying to focus on the private sector.
And so, do you have any priors on how would your result change if you added the public sector? Because it's quite important in most countries.
It is, although I'm not sure it's as important for wage inequality because, because it's already like a public sector premium, and you already have selection into the public sector. So what unions do on top of public sectorness, I think remains, in terms of wages and selection. I'm not sure they change it that much because, you just have there's a public sector premium already, and so the union premium on top of the public sector premium, I'm not sure is that large. And so, so I think for the questions of like the wage structure, I'm not sure like the union effect is so different from the public sector effect. But yeah, that's, but it's one reason we kind of tried to drop the union sector from like the labor economic side of it. In the paper with Ethan Kaplan on the political economy stuff, we have a whole, like, 1/4 of the paper is just about public sector unions and how they're involved in politics. And it's clearly, I think that's where public sector unions really matters as political actors in terms of influencing parties, trying to lobby for policies and things like that. And then that winds up being important for public finance and state capacity. But I think for the pure labor economics angle, it's like not gonna, I think, a focus.
More questions? Okay, Laura.
Thank you, Suresh. I was wondering about these spillovers that you talk about, because if I remember, and I might be oversimplifying, no? Ray knows much better, but the whole debate about the minimum wage, for example, in Mexico, was about, there's a point in that debate was, it's not going to have spillovers to other, workers, right? That was one of the selling points to actually stop controlling it so much, right? And then you talk about, unions being like the norm, like in some sectors or even economy-wide. So should we think them differently? The minimum wage differently as unions? Could they have a similar role? And so that's one thing. And the other thing is about the mechanisms, right? Is it because people don't like to feel that they're having, like an unfair wage increase compared to other people? Is that more an information issue that for most workers it's really hard to know what is the state of the economy, and then it's like these big negotiations become like a signal that, right now, or it's a mixture of the two?
So on the first one, I think one of the things that makes the collective bargaining different sometimes from the minimum wage, particularly in developing countries, is that the enforcement is very different. So in the minimum wage, right, you have to rely on some labor inspectors or, somebody has to be enforcing. That often doesn't happen. Similarly, when you have automatic extensions of collective bargaining agreements, who's enforcing? But when you have and I think you see this in Brazil, when you have like these CUT, like the real PT sort of like lefty unions that are really independent, they go in and they enforce with strikes and they enforce with their membership. And so you have this like in a weak state capacity enforcement regime, the unions can actually, like independent unions can provide an auxiliary form of enforcement that will like actually can generate very different mechanisms from like a minimum wage where like only the very large employers will bother to follow the rule and most employers will like try to get around it. But in some case where you actually have like somebody who's really trying to pay attention, then you can kind of increase the enforcement capacity. And so I think that's an interesting way in which collective bargaining, like even though on paper a collective bargaining agreement, it's just setting a bunch of minimum wages, and so the economics should be very similar. I think the enforcement technology can actually be different, and that's interesting. On the second question, I do think the unfairness. So I was questioning like the mechanism being how does collective bargaining actually stay enforced,
Why is it a norm? Why does it become a norm for other workers, non-covered workers?
Yeah, so sometimes it's literally that like in the US historically, it was sometimes the case that the unions just had ties to organized crime. and if an employer tried to undercut, they would get all of their buildings burned down. That's one way to enforce it. But the other way is often just that is that you'll either go on strike or you'll use all your political muscle and all of these. And basically, if an employers try to deviate from the sort of standing wage, there's a lot of both formal and informal pressure that the union can bring to bear to make sure that employer gets back in line. And the other side of this, that again, I think in the chapter we sort of say this, is that there's not a lot of research on employers associations, but employers associations are the other side of the collective bargain. And sometimes, in fact, the Garima Sharma at Northwestern has a paper on this, that the employers associations have been using the minimum wage in India as a collusion device. So basically, it's like the Employers Association gets to set the wage, the minimum wage, and has so much power that they're able to kind of use the sort of the minimum wage mechanism as a device to sort of collude on, we're going to set wages here. And so I think it's the other flip side of the collective bargaining apparatus, is that it's not always going to be used just by workers to win higher wages. It can also be used by employers sometimes to drive down wages. And so, it's complicated.
Hi, it was a really good paper. I like it a lot. I saw that you use a two-step model to identify the impacts. Did you try a different identification strategy just to confirm the results using a different strategy or not?
We basically did probing to robustness of covariates. And here's an interesting question, I think. You can take just what X's do you stick in the predicted wage, and you can just play with those a few different ways. And so we wound up settling on something that it's fairly ad hoc, but standard. The tricky thing is that all of the identification that we have for unions, it's so institutionally specific. So you need to either use regression discontinuities in the US, or you use an instrument from tax breaks on union dues in Norway, or you use something coming from collective bargaining renegotiation in Portugal. So there's the idea that you could implement a harmonized identification strategy across these different institutional environments. I just think it's actually impossible, because the things that get you causal variation in each context are going to be institutionally very specific. I think that's cool. It's kind of it's probably the way the world is, and you can imagine a richer, more structural model that was trying to embed all these different sources of identifying variation in some sort of common framework and leverage that as something to learn from. We didn't do that here. We were mostly interested in just documenting the heterogeneity. But yeah, I think doing this in kind of a more causal way would be great. But we didn't have to do that because it's a handbook chapter. So yeah.
Thank you, Suresh. I was wondering that in the Mexican case, unions suffer from a very low degree of democratization. In fact, the 2019 reform was in that direction. And I was wondering if you have explored the possibility of that lower degree of democratization within unions, explaining how higher coverage is not benefiting the lower salaries.
So that's really great. That's actually something I didn't talk about in the talk, but we do talk about in the paper. Is there's a section in the paper called "Who Do Unions Represent?" And sometimes they're and not just in Mexico, in the U.S. also, you just have completely corrupt unions that don't do anything so there's a couple of papers that are, so no one's done this for Mexico yet, but there's one set of papers by Lorenzo Lagos and co-authors on Brazil, where they basically estimate union-specific wage premia. So you can look at the same union, when it's covered and doesn't cover workers, and you can kind of then line up what characteristics of a union predict that it's able to get a higher wage for its members, and sort of finds things having, I don't remember if they have a measure of internal democracy of the union in there, but it's it's stuff like that they put in the regression. They actually have Lorenzo has another really nice paper about gender, where the PT and these Brazilian unions basically increase the share of female representation in the leadership of labor unions. And then they looked at how the collective bargaining agreements like changed. And basically you saw a lot more like maternity benefits and family-friendly benefits like come up in the collective bargaining agreements that were negotiated by unions after they raised the share of women in the leadership positions. There's another paper, I think in France by Simon Jaeger and Vladimir Pichu that also tries to do this like measuring what different unions do and trying to line it up with like their internal constitutions and like trying to see if like unions differ in terms of what they're able to get for workers based on like their internal kind of constitutions and mandates and things like that. So I think it's cool, you know, in the same way we have firm fixed effects, we can now think about there being like different unions having different fixed effects. And with this kind of rich administrative data that you have in Brazil, for example, you can actually estimate them and see what they do.
Well, I want to take advantage, Suresh, of asking you a question and related to the previous discussion that we had on the change in economics and how it's evolving, in particular about the econometric issues that you mentioned here. I mean, if it's basically many of the estimations are not identified if you assume like spillover effects, no? And so how do you think that we should adjust? I mean, you are assuming a sigma constant, and I think the question of Laura was, okay, what happens if that sigma is heterogeneous?
Yeah.
No? And that depends on other things. And how do we include those things in current analysis? Or what is your take?
So I think there's going to be two strategies, and hopefully I think they converge. One is going to rely on the kinds of like clever design things, like the aggregating many regression discontinuities and trying to form like empirical measures of spillovers that are carefully identified. The other family, I think, is going to be taking models seriously, where you're like, all right, we have to take a stand on what spillovers are going to, what is the network of spillovers we're willing to pay attention to, and we're going to have to estimate that network, and it's going to involve making some assumptions that are like purely coming from theory to do that, and you know, and I think you just kind of, it's like in the way that any general equilibrium thing, you hit the limit at some point in which like your causal identification tools just run out, because there's no observed counterfactual to the whole system being different. So you kind of have to take a stand on the on like how this whole thing is going to look different, how the whole counterfactual is going to look different, and that's going to involve making some theoretical assumptions as well as some empirical ones. And what I would like, so here's the unfortunate thing, is that all of the ways economists have of doing that kind of work are so restricted. It's like you're either doing like, you know, you either have a family of trade models or a family of like macro models or a family of IO models that are very stylized and only let you think of the only general equilibrium forces that are at play are the ones operating through markets. But when you think about unions operating on setting wages, not via just like the competition or supply and demand spillovers, where the spillovers are happening through norms, what's the canonical model of spillovers due to norms? We don't have one. And so I think it's going to be, what would be nice is that actually the study of collective bargaining and unions lets us get like a richer library of the possible forces at work. So you're not just thinking about the only spillovers as running through markets. You're also allowing there to be spillovers through like social pressure and through politics, and we don't yet have those models. Although we're working on it, I think. Well, yeah.
Roxana.
Thank you so much for your very interesting presentation. I was thinking about the mechanism between collective bargaining and wages, and what is or what it could be the impact of on productivity, or the productivity, the role of productivity in the connection between collective bargaining and wages. I am thinking about at least 2 ways in order to think about the productivity. First is the impact of collective bargaining on the behavior among workers and among firms. From the perspective of workers, we can say, or we can think about, for instance, efficiency wages associated with the increasing wages as a consequence of collective bargaining, but at the same time, we can think about the changes in the behavior of firms associated or as a consequence of collective bargaining. And second way is through the inclusion of this topic, the productivity, inside the topics discussed in the collective bargaining, as increasingly we can see in some countries in Latin America and in some specific collective bargaining. So how to include in this discussion the potential role and the potential impact and the role, right? And the consequence and the cause of productivity in the impact of the collective bargaining on wages. Thank you.
Yeah, so great, good question. It actually, I think, used to be it was like the focus, I think, of like previous handbook chapters was like labor unions and productivity, and that was the whole chapter. And so we were much more focused on wage inequality than productivity per se. There's, again, I think with this like great administrative data now, you can kind of get firms you can kind of get like the firm balance sheets attached to the collective bargaining agreement, attached to the wage structure. So you can like really see kind of how much of the productivity, and so I think there's a paper in Canada by Lemia and co-authors that basically attributes about like 40% of the raw difference between union and non-union to like selection into different productivity firms, which keeps kind of still like the union premium is like still like 10-15% above and beyond the productivity effect. I'm sure that's going to be different in different places, and you can imagine one way to think about it, I think, is like who's got the like scarce investment. So if capital is the scarce investment and you're kind of giving bargaining power to workers, that's probably going to lower productivity. But if workers have the like scarce investment and then you give power to unions, that's probably going to raise productivity. And so one of the things that happened, I think, during COVID in the US that was interesting, and I think there's a lot to unpack in it, is how much like the tech sector got interested in unions in the US. So like Google and Microsoft all had like unionization attempts that, are very small, but it was like for the first time the tech sector was like interested in unionizing. And I think that's one reason Silicon Valley pivoted to Trump, to be honest, as they were like petrified of their workforces. But and you can imagine a world in which that's a sector in which when you increase employees' bargaining power, they invest more in their skills and effort, and you get maybe higher productivity. Okay. Before AI, at least. Yeah.
So before saying goodbye, just to say thank you to Suresh, and I forgot to say, and it's important, that so Suresh has been a very good friend of El Colegio de Mexico. He has not only come before, but he also, like 8 years ago, he welcomed Uni, one of our students, and now in the master's students, and now she's a PhD student at Brown, and he welcomed Uni like 8 years ago, I think, in Colombia for the summer. So thank you very much, Suresh. And we are celebrating our 60th anniversary, and probably this is the end of the 60th anniversary in the following days. And we have some special coins that we made for the celebration, and we want to give you one of those coins, Suresh. So thank you very much for coming. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Oh, wow. Thank you. Cool, thank you.
Para quienes están invitados a la comida, va a ser en la sala.